I still remember that morning like it happened yesterday. The sunlight was soft, peeking through the half-drawn curtains, touching the edge of our kitchen table. The kettle was boiling, just like it always did, but the air felt heavier that day. I didn't know it then, but it was the last morning we would share together as husband and wife. He sat quietly across from me, no words, no smile, just silence. The kind that fills every corner of a home and makes you feel small inside it. I asked if something was wrong. He shook his head, pretending everything was fine, but his eyes, they told a different story. He looked at me one last time, his face tired, his hands trembling just a little, and then in the calmest voice, he said the words that would echo in my heart for years. "You'll be fine without me." Just 6 words, 6 small words that broke something deep inside me. I wanted to laugh, to ask him what he meant, to stop him before he walked away, but instead, I just stood there, frozen. Maybe a part of me already knew this was coming. Maybe we both did. He picked up his small bag from the chair. There wasn't much in it, just a few clothes, his toothbrush, the book he always read before bed. He didn't slam the door. He didn't shout. He just left, quietly. And as the door closed behind him, I felt something strange. Not anger, not shock, just emptiness. A kind of quiet that sits on your chest and won't move. I remember looking around the kitchen, the cup of tea he didn't finish, the toast still warm, the chair slightly pushed back. I sat down where he'd been sitting and whispered to myself, "No, I won't be fine without you." That was the morning my world fell silent. And for a long time, I didn't know how to fill that silence again. But life has a way of moving, even when you don't want it to. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and I began to understand that sometimes people don't leave because they stop loving you. They leave because they can't stay anymore. Still, those 6 words, "You'll be fine without me," never stopped echoing. I met him when I was 22. Back then, I didn't know much about life. I was just a quiet girl who loved simple things. Morning tea, reading in the balcony, helping my mother in the kitchen. He came into my life like spring after a long winter. He wasn't loud or charming in the way people usually describe love stories. He was soft-spoken, kind, and always a little serious. But when he smiled, it felt like the whole world slowed down just for me. We met through family friends. He had just started working in another city and came home on weekends. I still remember that first conversation, how we both avoided eye contact, both smiling at the floor more than at each other. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fireworks, it was something gentle, the kind of feeling that grows quietly until it becomes part of you. When we got married, everyone said we were perfect for each other, and for a long time, I believed that too. Our first home was small, just 2 rooms and a tiny kitchen, but it was ours. The walls smelled of paint and the floor creaked when you walked. Still, I loved every corner of it. Every evening, I'd wait for him to come home. I'd prepare dinner, light a small candle, and hum softly while stirring the curry. He used to call my name in that calm voice, "Rita," and I'd turn, smiling, pretending I wasn't waiting for him all day. Those were simple, beautiful days. We didn't have much, but we had each other. He had a dream to build a better life for us. He worked long hours, sometimes even on weekends. I understood, or at least I tried to. I wanted to support him, to be the reason he smiled when he came home tired. But slowly, things started changing. Not all at once, just small things at first. The dinners became quieter, the goodnight kisses became shorter, and the laughter that once filled our tiny home began to fade, replaced by silence. I thought it was just stress. Everyone goes through difficult times, I told myself.
But what I didn't realize was that silence can become a habit. It creeps in slowly until one day you realize you've forgotten how to talk to each other. He began staying late at work more often. When he came home, he'd sit on the balcony, scrolling through his phone or staring at nothing. I'd sit beside him sometimes, trying to start conversations, like, "How was your day? Did you eat anything?" But his answers grew shorter each time. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was boring. Maybe I talked too much, or maybe not enough. Maybe I wasn't doing enough to make him happy. I started cooking his favorite dishes, wearing the perfume he liked, waiting up for him even when my eyes could barely stay open. He noticed, I think, but noticing and caring are not the same thing. One night, as I waited for him to come home, I fell asleep on the sofa. It must have been past midnight when I woke up and found him sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, his face buried in his hands. "Are you okay?" I whispered. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes looked tired, not just from work, but from something deeper. He just said, "Yeah, I'm fine. Go to sleep." But I couldn't sleep that night because I knew something inside him was changing and I had no idea how to stop it. Months passed like that. He smiled less, talked less, and the home that once felt warm began to feel like a waiting room, two people sitting together waiting for something that never comes. I tried to fix things. I suggested taking a trip, visiting his parents, even watching movies like we used to. He always said, "Maybe later," but later never came. I remember one evening I cooked his favorite meal, chicken biryani. The smell filled the house, and for a moment I felt hopeful again. When he walked in, I smiled. "I made biryani tonight." He nodded, set his bag down and said, "I already ate." It felt like something inside me broke a little that night, not because of the food, but because I realized I was no longer part of his world. Still, I stayed patient. I believed love could fix anything if you just held on long enough. So I held on. I prayed, I waited, and I told myself that every marriage goes through phases, that maybe he just needed time. But time only pulled us further apart. He started sleeping on the couch sometimes, saying he didn't want to disturb me because of my light sleep. I knew that wasn't true, but I didn't argue, because arguing meant pushing him further away, and I was already losing him slowly, piece by piece. Sometimes I'd hear him talking softly on the phone, his tone lighter than it ever was with me. When I'd ask who it was, he'd say, "Just a friend from work." I wanted to believe him, and maybe it really was just a friend, but the tone in his voice, it wasn't the tone of friendship. It was the tone of escape. And yet, I couldn't hate him. I couldn't even be angry, because I loved him, the same way I did the day we got married, maybe even more. That's the thing about love. It doesn't always fade when it should. Sometimes it stays long after the person is gone. Our anniversary came that year. I waited all day, thinking maybe he'd remember. I even baked a small cake, the kind he liked, with chocolate and almonds on top. But he came home late again, looked at the table and said, softly, "I forgot." I smiled and said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay at all. That night, I sat on the balcony alone, watching the city lights. I realized I was living beside him, but not with him. We were two strangers sharing the same roof, pretending nothing was broken. And deep down, I think he knew it too. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with guilt in his eyes, not pity, not anger, just guilt. And I think that guilt was the beginning of his goodbye. Because a few months later, on that quiet morning, he looked at me across the kitchen table and said those words that would change everything. "You'll be fine without me."
After that morning, the words, "You'll be fine without me," never left my mind. They replayed every time I saw his empty chair, every time the phone rang and it wasn't him, every time I woke up and reached out to the other side of the bed only to find cold sheets. At first, I told myself he'd come back. He just needed space, a little time to think. Maybe we'd talk it out. Maybe he'd realize that love doesn't just disappear overnight. I told myself stories to stay sane, because sometimes lies are easier to live with than the truth you're not ready to face. The first few days, I didn't cry. I just waited. I made his favorite breakfast like I always did, tea, toast, and 2 boiled eggs, even though I knew he wasn't coming. I couldn't stop myself. Habit feels like love when you've lost the person it was meant for. Neighbors came by sometimes, asking if everything was all right. I'd smile and say, "He's traveling for work." The words tasted strange, but I couldn't bear to admit that he'd left, because saying it out loud would make it real. At night, I sat on the balcony where we used to talk about everything, dreams, plans, nonsense, and I'd stare at the sky, wondering if he was looking at it too. I used to believe that love connected people, even across distance. But distance changes people, and slowly it started changing me too. A month passed, then 2. One evening, I got a call from his sister. Her voice was soft, careful. "Rita, are you okay?" I smiled, pretending not to understand the question. "Of course I am. Why wouldn't I be?" She hesitated, then whispered, "He's been staying with a friend. I think he doesn't know how to talk to you right now." Her words hit me harder than I expected. He didn't know how to talk to me? We had shared a life, a home, years of laughter and pain, and now he didn't even know how to speak to me. I thanked her for calling, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. My tea went cold and I didn't even notice. That night, I opened the closet and saw his clothes still hanging there, neatly folded, untouched. I pressed my face against one of his shirts. It still smelled like him, a mix of cologne and something faintly like rain. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a whisper. Why wasn't I enough? Days turned into months. People stopped asking where he was. Maybe they knew, maybe they just didn't want to embarrass me. Life around me kept moving. Weddings, festivals, neighbors visiting, but inside, I was frozen in time. I started working at a small school nearby. Teaching kept me busy, and children have a way of softening pain without even knowing it. They draw me little pictures, bring flowers from the garden, and call me Miss Rita in their sweet voices. But every day when I returned home, the quiet would wrap around me again. I'd unlock the door, walk in, and for a moment imagine hearing his voice, "Rita, I'm home." But there was only silence. Always silence. I stopped setting 2 plates for dinner. I stopped talking to his photo on the shelf. I told myself I was healing, but healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning how to live with what still hurts. Then one evening, he called. It had been 6 months. I remember because it was raining that night, and I was sitting by the window with a book I wasn't really reading. When the phone rang and his name appeared on the screen, my heart stopped for a second. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" For a moment, there was just silence. Then his voice, calm, almost unfamiliar. "Rita, how are you?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask where he was, if he was eating well, if he missed me even a little, but instead I said, "I'm fine." He sighed softly. "Good. I knew you would be." Those words again, the same ones that broke me before. "You'll be fine." He talked for a while. Small things, polite things, like he was calling an old friend. And then he said it, the thing I'd feared most. "I think it's better if we stop holding on. You deserve to be happy, Rita. I can't give you that anymore." I remember feeling my throat tighten, but my voice stayed calm. Was I that hard to love? He didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing, struggling for words. Then he said quietly, "No, you were easy to love. Too easy. I don't know who I am anymore." And that was it. He hung up soon after, saying he had to go. No goodbye, just silence again. That night, I cried for the first time in months. Not because I missed him, I'd been missing him every day, but because I realized he wasn't coming back. The next morning, I went through the house and started packing his things, not because I wanted to erase him, but because I needed to breathe again. Every corner had a piece of him, his books, his jacket, his mug. I packed them gently, one by one, like fragile memories. When I reached the drawer near the bed, I found a small notebook. It was his. Inside were random notes, reminders, and pages filled with handwriting I knew so well. On one page, he'd written something simple. "She deserves peace. I just can't give it to her." I closed the notebook and held it against my chest. Maybe he truly believed leaving was the only way to free me from his emptiness. But he never understood that his absence was the only thing that ever broke my peace. Weeks later, his mother came to visit. She was kind, gentle like him, but her eyes carried guilt. She sat with me over tea and said softly, "He doesn't talk much anymore. He keeps everything inside. But I know he misses you." I smiled faintly. "Then why doesn't he come home?" She sighed. "Sometimes men don't know how to face the people they've hurt. They think leaving will make things easier for everyone." Her words made sense, but they didn't comfort me because it's never easier for the one left behind. I began to change after that. Slowly, quietly. I stopped waiting by the door. I stopped checking my phone at night. I learned to eat alone, to sleep alone, to live without hearing his footsteps in the hallway. But healing doesn't happen in a straight line. Some nights, I'd still wake up crying, dreaming he was beside me. Some mornings, I'd pour 2 cups of tea before realizing it was just me again. Loneliness became my shadow, always there, always quiet, but it taught me something important. You can survive things you never thought you could. I started visiting my mother more often. She'd noticed the sadness in my eyes, but she never asked too many questions. She just made me tea, held my hand, and told me stories from her younger days, stories about how love isn't always forever, but kindness can be. One afternoon, I saw him again. It was nearly a year since he left. I was at the market buying vegetables when I saw him across the street. He looked different, thinner, quieter, somehow older. Our eyes met for a moment and time stopped. He didn't smile, neither did I. We just stood there, 2 people who once shared a home, now strangers in the middle of a busy street.
He started walking toward me, but then his phone rang. He looked at the screen, answered it, and walked away. And just like that, he was gone again. I didn't cry that time. I just stood there, holding a bag of tomatoes, watching the crowd move around me like nothing had happened. But something inside me finally shifted. I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. That night when I came home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the balcony. The air was cool, the city quiet. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. I looked up at the stars and whispered softly, "Maybe you were right. Maybe I will be fine without you, but it still hurts that you had to leave for me to learn that." The words didn't come from anger. They came from peace. A fragile kind of peace, but peace nonetheless. Because
Love doesn't always end with closure. Sometimes it ends with understanding. And slowly, I began to understand that he didn't leave because I wasn't enough. He left because he couldn't face his own emptiness. Still, a small part of me would always love the man who once sat across the kitchen table, smiled, and made me feel like I was home. That was the rise of the conflict. Not loud, not cruel, just the quiet breaking of something once beautiful. And the hardest part was learning to live with what remained. It happened one quiet night in early winter. The house was colder than usual, though the heater was on. The walls seemed to hold the chill of everything I'd been hiding inside me. I had finished my dinner alone, washed the single plate, and sat by the window with a cup of tea that had already gone lukewarm. The street outside was silent, except for the occasional sound of a dog barking far away. That's when it hit me. The weight of all the days that had passed since he left. It wasn't one big wave of sadness. It was 1,000 small ones that had finally decided to crash together. I looked around our living room, our wedding photo on the wall, the empty chair near the bookshelf, the clock that ticked too loudly in the silence. Everything felt frozen in time, like the house was still waiting for him even when I had stopped. And that's when I finally broke. Not the loud kind of breaking, not the dramatic kind they show in movies, just the quiet kind where tears fall without permission and your body starts trembling from the weight of holding it all in. I sat on the floor, my back against the sofa, and cried until I couldn't anymore. I cried for the girl who waited. I cried for the woman who kept pretending everything was fine. And I cried for the love that had no home to return to. When the tears finally stopped, I felt empty. Not better, not worse, just hollow. There was nothing left to say to anyone, but my heart felt heavy with words I'd never spoken. So I did what I hadn't done in months. I pulled out my old notebook, the one where I used to write recipes and small reminders, and I began to write. It wasn't a letter I ever planned to send. It was just something I needed to say somewhere, even if only the paper heard it. I began with simple words. I don't know where to start. Maybe because I never thought I'd have to write something like this. My hand trembled as I wrote, but I kept going. You said I'd be fine without you, and I tried to believe that. I told myself you must have had a reason for leaving, that maybe you were hurting too. But the truth is, I wasn't fine. I missed you every day, in the small things, in the quiet moments, in the empty space beside me at night. I paused and stared at the page. It felt strange to see my pain written in ink, like it belonged to someone else. But I kept writing. I tried to hate you. I tried to replace you with anger because anger is easier than sadness. But it didn't work. The love stayed. It stayed even when you didn't. The words flowed faster after that. I wrote about the mornings I still made 2 cups of tea. I wrote about the nights I left the balcony light on, just in case he came home late. I wrote about how I learned to smile at people even when I was breaking inside. You see, I didn't stop loving you when you left. I stopped loving the silence you left behind. At one point, I stopped and looked out the window. The streetlights blurred through my tears. I realized that I wasn't just writing to him, I was writing to myself, to the part of me that still waited at that kitchen table for him to turn back. So I changed how I wrote. The you slowly became me. You'll be fine, you said, but I never told you what fine meant for me. Fine meant waking up and pretending I didn't care. Fine meant hiding tears behind smiles when people asked about you. Fine meant learning how to breathe in an empty room. I took a deep breath and wrote, maybe you thought leaving would set me free, but all it did was teach me how strong a heart can be when it's left with no choice. And then I wrote the words that hurt the most. I forgive you. My hand shook as I wrote them, but they felt right. Because forgiveness wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. About letting go of the weight that was slowly crushing me. I forgive you for walking away when I needed you. I forgive you for the silence. I forgive you for loving me once and then forgetting how to stay. I forgive you because I can't carry this pain forever. I don't know how long I wrote. The clock struck midnight, then 1, then 2. By the time I stopped, the notebook was filled with pages of raw, messy truth, parts of me I'd never said out loud. When I put down the pen, the air felt lighter. The room was still empty, but the emptiness didn't scare me anymore. It felt like I had finally opened a window after years of holding my breath. I closed the notebook and placed it inside the drawer where I kept old letters and photographs. Then I sat quietly, staring at the wall where our wedding photo hung. In that photo, we were smiling, so sure of our forever. Looking at it now, I didn't feel anger or regret. I just felt gratitude. Because once upon a time, it was real. It may not have lasted, but it was real. A few days later, I had decided to clean the house again. I dusted the shelves, folded laundry, changed the curtains. It wasn't about moving on. It was about reclaiming the space that had stopped feeling like mine. I found an old album under the bed. Pictures from our trips, birthdays, random selfies. I sat cross-legged on the floor and looked through them, smiling through quiet tears. There was one photo where he was laughing, his hand reaching out to cover the camera because I had surprised him mid-bite. I traced his face with my finger and whispered, "You were happy once. So was I." That's when I realized love doesn't fail because 2 people stop caring. Sometimes it fails because they stop showing up for each other. We had both stopped showing up. He left physically, but maybe I had left emotionally long before that, when I stopped asking, when I started pretending everything was fine. And he too carried his own silence, his own fears, his own tiredness. Understanding that didn't make the pain vanish, but it made it gentler. It's easier to forgive someone when you stop seeing them as a villain and start seeing them as human. That night, I opened the notebook again and added one last line at the end. If you ever wonder whether I was fine without you, I was. But not because you were right, because I learned to be. Then I closed it for good. After that, something changed in me. I started sleeping better. The mornings didn't feel so heavy anymore. I began to take long walks after work, past the same park where we once sat on the grass laughing about nothing. The memories were still there, but they stopped hurting the same way. They became part of my story, not a wound, just a scar that reminded me I had loved deeply once. Sometimes, when I saw couples walking together, I felt a small ache inside, but it wasn't jealousy. It was gratitude that I had known that kind of love, even if it didn't last. Weeks later, I went to the post office to send some school papers. While waiting in line, I saw people posting letters, birthday cards, love notes, small envelopes full of hope. I thought about my letter, the one still sitting in the drawer. For a moment, I considered mailing it, but then I realized I didn't need to. It had already done its job. I smiled softly and whispered to myself, some letters don't need to reach anyone. They just need to leave your heart. When I got home that evening, the sky was turning orange. I sat on the balcony with my cup of tea, the same spot where I once waited for him. This time, I wasn't waiting for anyone. I was just watching the sunset, listening to the birds returning to their nests. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had stopped trying to fix what was meant to end. And as the last bit of sunlight faded, I whispered softly, maybe you were right. I am fine. But this time, the words didn't sting. They felt like freedom. That was the turning point. Not a moment of anger or revenge, but a quiet realization born out of tears and ink. I didn't need his apology to heal. I just needed my own forgiveness to move forward. The days that followed were soft and slow. Nothing really changed in the world outside. The same roads, the same neighbors, the same rhythm of mornings and nights, but something had shifted inside me. It wasn't visible, not even to me at first, but it was there. It showed up in small ways. The way I opened the curtains in the morning instead of keeping them half closed, the way I started playing old songs while cooking, or how I smiled back when someone greeted me in the street. The sadness was still there, but it had become quieter, like a familiar melody that no longer hurt to hear. I went back to my routines, only this time I did them differently. Before, everything I did carried a weight of waiting for him to call, waiting for something to change, waiting for time to fix things. But now I wasn't waiting for anyone. I was simply living. I started going to the park on Sunday mornings, the same park where we used to sit years ago, but now I walked alone, watching families with children, couples sharing snacks, old men reading newspapers under trees. I would sit on a bench with my cup of coffee and just watch life move around me. There was something healing about that, realizing that the world hadn't stopped with my heartbreak. It kept going, and slowly I began to move with it. One day, I met an old friend from college, Sarah. We hadn't seen each other in years. She hugged me tightly and said, "You look calmer now, different, in a good way." Her words surprised me. Calmer, different. I smiled and said, "Maybe because I stopped fighting everything." She nodded. "Peace suits you," she said softly. We sat at a small cafe near the market and talked for hours about our lives, our families, the things we'd both lost and learned. When she asked about him, I didn't flinch the way I used to. I simply said, "He's doing what he needs to, and I'm learning to do the same." For the first time, those words didn't sound like an excuse.
They felt true. That evening, after I returned home, I looked at myself in the mirror. I had new lines near my eyes, a little more gray in my hair, but my reflection didn't feel like a stranger anymore. It felt like a woman who had survived something quietly and come out softer, not harder. I whispered to my reflection, "You're still here, and that's enough." There were still moments of loneliness, of course. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake up and reach for the other side of the bed, only to find it empty. But I no longer cried when that happened. Instead, I would close my eyes and remind myself that loneliness isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's a place where healing begins. A few weeks later, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I traveled. It wasn't far, just a small coastal town 2 hours away. I packed a small bag, boarded a bus, and sat by the window watching the fields and trees blur past. There was something freeing about being on the road alone. No destination waiting, no one asking when I'd be back. When I reached the seaside, I stood at the shore for a long time. The sound of the waves felt like a heartbeat, strong, steady, endless. I thought about him again, but this time not with pain, just gratitude. Because even though he left, he had unknowingly given me something, a reason to find myself again. I sat on the sand, took off my shoes, and let the waves touch my feet. The water was cold, but it felt alive. I closed my eyes and whispered, "You said you'd be fine without me. And maybe in some way, you were right." But I didn't mean it the way he had. He said it to leave. I said it to begin. When I returned home, I felt lighter. I started writing again. Not letters, but small journal entries about my days. Little things like, had tea with a friend, watched the sunset, didn't cry today. They were simple lines, but they meant everything to me. Each sentence was a step forward, proof that I was learning how to live again, one quiet moment at a time. One evening, as I was tidying up, I came across his old scarf in a drawer. It still smelled faintly of him, that mix of aftershave and winter air I used to love. I held it for a long moment, smiling softly. Then, instead of putting it back, I folded it neatly and placed it in a box with the rest of his things. Not to erase him, but to finally let the space breathe again. I whispered, "Thank you for being part of my story." And then I closed the box. The next morning, I took the box to the attic. When I placed it there, I didn't feel like I was burying the past. I felt like I was giving it a place to rest. Afterwards, I sat by the window and watched the sunlight fall across the room. Everything looked softer, warmer, as if the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. A few months passed. Seasons changed. The silence of winter turned into the hum of spring. I began planting small pots of flowers on my balcony. Daisies, marigolds, jasmine. Every morning I would water them, touch their leaves gently, and smile as they grew. It became my quiet ritual, a promise to myself that no matter what leaves, something else can always bloom. One afternoon, while I was watering the plants, a letter arrived in the mail. My hands froze when I saw the handwriting. It was his. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the envelope. So many thoughts ran through my mind. Should I open it? Should I ignore it? After a few minutes, I sat down and carefully opened it. It wasn't long, just a few lines written in his familiar handwriting. "I hope you're doing okay. I've been thinking a lot lately. I wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I left, for the silence, for everything I made you carry alone. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that you were never the problem. Take care of yourself. You deserve peace." I stared at the letter for a long time, My eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. I folded the paper neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and smiled. I didn't need to write back. There was nothing left to say, because peace had already found me. That night, I went to sleep feeling a quiet sense of closure. It wasn't the kind that comes from getting answers. It was the kind that comes from no longer needing them. I realized something that night. Love doesn't always end when people walk away. Sometimes it transforms into something else, something softer, something that teaches you how to stay with yourself. Weeks turned into months, the pain became memory, and the memory became story. I began volunteering at a local library on weekends. It was peaceful there. The smell of books, the quiet rustle of pages, the calm faces of people who came to read. One afternoon, a young girl came to me with tears in her eyes. She had just gone through a breakup and didn't know how to move on. She asked softly, "Does it ever stop hurting?" I looked at her trembling hands, her broken heart, and I saw my younger self in her. I smiled gently and said, "It doesn't stop hurting all at once, but one day you'll wake up and realize you've stopped counting the days since it ended. That's when you'll know you've healed." Her eyes softened and she whispered, "Thank you." As she walked away, I felt something warm inside me, a quiet pride, because the pain that once broke me was now helping someone else. Maybe that's what healing really is, when your wounds stop bleeding and start giving light. Every now and then, I still think about him, not with longing, not with sadness, just with a quiet kind of affection for who we were. Because even though he left, he was part of the story that led me here, to this version of myself who knows how to stand alone, how to love without losing herself, how to let go without bitterness. One evening, as I was closing the windows, I saw a small note stuck in between the pages of my old notebook, the one where I had written that unsent letter. It read, "You'll be fine without me." I smiled softly and whispered, "I was." Then I tore the small note gently, not out of anger, but as a quiet goodbye. The pieces fluttered into the bin like feathers, and for the first time, the words didn't feel like a curse. They felt like a lesson I had already learned. The next morning, I woke up early and stood by the window as sunlight filled the room. I made tea for one, opened the balcony door, and breathed in the fresh air. Life was simple again, but this time it wasn't empty. I had filled it with new memories, small ones, but real. And as I watched the world wake up, I whispered softly,
Some stories don't end with a reunion. They end with peace. That's how my story found its resolution, not through someone coming back, but through me coming home to myself. It's strange how life goes on after someone leaves. At first, it feels impossible, like every clock has stopped. Every breath is heavier than the last. But then, one quiet morning, you open your eyes, and the sun feels a little warmer again. You make tea, hum an old song, water the plants, and you realize you're still here. That's how it happened for me. Not all at once, not with any big moment of change, just slowly, one heartbeat at a time. Sometimes, when I think back to the day he said, "You'll be fine without me," I still feel a small ache somewhere deep inside. Because no matter how much time passes, some words leave an echo that never fully fades. But that ache isn't pain anymore. It's memory. It's the sound of what was and the quiet proof that I survived it. I don't hate him. I never could. Hate feels too heavy to carry for someone you once loved so deeply. What I feel now is something softer,
Maybe understanding, maybe forgiveness. Because love doesn't just disappear when someone walks away. It changes shape. It becomes gratitude for the days you shared, the laughter you once had, the lessons you didn't know you were learning. There are still nights when I sit by the window with the blanket around my shoulders and let the silence fill the room. It used to make me cry. Now, I let it stay. Silence, I've learned, is not always loneliness. Sometimes it's peace. Sometimes it's just space where your heart finally learns to rest. I used to think that being alone meant something was missing, that love had to mean someone beside you. But now I see it differently. Love can also mean being gentle with yourself. It can mean learning to smile again without needing a reason. It can mean sitting with your memories and not feeling broken by them anymore. People often ask me if I ever got closure. I never know how to answer that. Because closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you create when you stop chasing answers that no longer matter. Maybe that's what growing older teaches you. To make peace with unfinished stories. To understand that some people enter your life only to teach you how to let go. I think about the version of me who stood in that kitchen years ago, holding a cup of tea while he packed his small bag. She thought her world had ended that day. But she didn't know that her real life was just beginning. She didn't know that she would learn to live again, to laugh again, to walk through mornings without a shadow beside her, and still feel complete. If I could tell her anything now, I would say, you were right to love him, and you were brave to let him go. Every story has a quiet turning point. Not the moment someone leaves, but the moment you realize you can stay. Stay in your own life. Stay with your own heart. Stay with hope, even when everything you planned has changed. That was my real turning point. The day I stopped asking why he left and started asking, what now? Years later, when people see me smile, they assume I've never been broken. But I think the truth is the opposite. I smile because I have been. Because I've known what it's like to lose everything and still find something worth waking up for. The peace I have now didn't come easily. It came through nights of tears, through words I never said, through letters I never sent. But it came, quietly, gently, like dawn after a long night. Sometimes I still dream of him, not in a painful way, just small moments. Him laughing, fixing the curtain, reading by the window. In those dreams, he isn't leaving. He's just there. And when I wake up, I smile and whisper, I hope you found your peace too. Because that's the truth about love. Real love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means wishing someone well, even from afar. I've learned that heartbreak doesn't define you. What defines you is how you choose to heal, whether you close yourself off or open again to life, even when it scares you. I chose to open, and maybe that's why, even after everything, I still believe in love. Not the kind that promises forever, but the kind that teaches you to survive, to forgive, and to start again. Now when I look at my life, I don't see emptiness. I see quiet mornings filled with sunlight, small laughter shared with friends, letters written only to myself, and a woman who finally knows her own worth. He said, "You'll be fine without me." And maybe for a long time I wasn't.
but now I am. And that, I think, is enough. Some stories don't end with someone coming back. They end when your heart does. And sometimes that's the most peaceful ending of all.